So I'd like to welcome people who are here in person in Leeds Beckett. Yorkshire Riviera, as it appears to be today. It's hot and sunny. I don't know how long that will last. And an audience of various people online at various parts of the world. So I'd like to welcome you all. I'm definitely the first person at this university to clock up 30 years as a professor. Maybe some others coming up behind with 20 plus or 25, but we only became a university in '92. Before that, I think we only had one professor who was the head of the Leeds Poly, as it then was, Patrick Nutchins. He decided no one else would be a professor. So I decided this would be a fitting way to mark 30 years, and I call it 30 years of thinking informatically. And I'd like to thank, I put it to Akin, our dean, who's just appeared. I know he's got a very early flight tomorrow, so I appreciate that. And Liz Schofield, who's helped enormously in arranging this. So I became a professor of informatics. Technically, I got the appointment in July, August '93, and I gave my inaugural in 1994. And I chose the term professor of informatics. It's a term that was very common across lots of other European languages, and the term has now become synonymous with computer science. I've never understood why computer scientists weren't happy just to be computer scientists. They had to have informatics. And I think it was probably Donald Mitchell at the University of Edinburgh in the mid-90s who decided that it would have this idea about algorithms and structure and interactions and so on. But that really only came about in the late 90s, that it became a term. So I was a professor of informatics before the computer scientists stole it. And my inspiration was wonderful work by a woman called Donna Haraway. Some of her more recent writing is more opaque, let's say, but she wrote a book that is certainly well worth reading called The Cyborg Manifesto. An early version of that from the 80s was this manifesto for cyborgs, as she called them. And it's the definition, I think, which sums up my interests. Informatics encompasses the technologies of information, as well as the biological, social, linguistic, and cultural changes that initiate, accompany, and complicate their development. The only thing I added was to put in information and communication, because of course IT rapidly became much more, the technologies became much more about how people communicate, not just the information. There's a little subtext, a little sub-theme that runs through the slides, you'll notice. I love that idea. I'm a great Joycean. I love Ulysses. I read it most years around Bloomsday. But the quotes in yellow are all from a single source. You'll probably guess who it is at some point. I'm not going to go through them. They're there just to make sure you're attending. Okay, so one of my favourite history books it's a very English one. It's got a very English sense of humour by Seller and Yateman. It's called 1066 and All That. It's a lovely history book. It has this wonderful subtitle, A Memorable History of England, comprising all the parts you can remember, 103 good things, 5 bad kings, and 2 genuine dates. And I actually apologise. They say we wanted to get rid of all the dates, but we had to keep 2 of them. One of them obviously is 1066. I'll leave you to read it and have a look. It's a very thin book, well worth reading. So I want to talk about 1994 and all that. I'm going to have 3 dates actually, and I'm going to talk about a few good things and a few more ambivalent things. So what was going on in 1994? Well, it was 10 years after 1984, sort of inscribed, particularly in Orwell's book. It was 5 years on from the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Berlin Wall. Also 5 years on from the creation of the World Wide Web. The two, obviously, was a nice coincidence. It was interesting. The Cold War comes to an end, and then this technology for communicating across the world comes into existence. Apple released their first Power Macintosh, and this was a time between Steve Jobs' first incarnation as head of Apple and his second. He goes off at one point. Apple is a moderately interesting company in the 80s and 90s before he comes back in and takes it up to where it is now. The Linux kernel version, the basis of open source software, Linux being the version of Unix developed by the Scandinavian Linus Torvalds when he was, I think he was 20 or something, and it's the basis of open source, very important aspect. Nelson Mandela becomes president of the Republic of South Africa. And Griselda was born in South Africa, in Bloemfontein, and when our kids were small, I remember, I think Ben went to the supermarket and he picked up a pear or an orange. South Africa in those days marketed their fruit as something called outspan, hoping people would think it was from Spain. But it wasn't, it was from South Africa. And he was told, put it back. And he said, when can I have one? And Griselda said to him, when Nelson Mandela becomes president of South Africa. So, 94, we bought some outspan or South African pears. Jeff Bezos founded Amazon, which was basically an online bookstore in those days. And a bit of retrospective history. IBM produced something called the Simon Personal Communicator. I don't remember it at all, which is now sometimes referred to as the first smartphone. But other people have come up with other things that were the first smartphone, but obviously well before the real smartphone. And in 2006, I wrote a book called Thinking Informatically. And I adapted the title from Zygmunt Bauman's book, Thinking Sociologically. Zygmunt Bauman was a world-renowned sociologist, professor of sociology in Leeds. He's actually the reason I came to Leeds. There was a one-year temporary job in the 70s in Leeds, and I came up here and been around ever since for a whole variety of reasons. Zygmunt also wrote an introduction to the book, and what I was trying to do was to explain the way in which, in order to look at this idea of Haraway's idea of what informatics was, that people need to think in particular ways and deal with certain aspects. And what I realized was in 2006 that actually I'd been thinking informatically for a very long time. So a bit like Monsieur Jourdain, if you know Molière's Le Bourgeois Gentilhomme, this is a sort of a bourgeois person who makes money and tries to become aristocratic, and he tries to inveigle himself in with our aristocrats, and he gets people to teach him, and of course they all flatter him while taking his money. And for the younger members of the audience, this was not what we dressed like in the 1990s, this is from much earlier. His philosophy tutor tells him that he's been talking prose for the last 40 years, and he thinks this is amazing. So I'd been trying to think informatically for a long time, and it goes all the way back to when I started in what was then Leeds Polytechnic in 1986. I'd originally been a sociologist. I come up, as I say, for a one-year job in the University of Leeds in sociology. Then I had a one-year job in Durham. And then Maggie Thatcher and Keith Joseph decided that social sciences weren't a science, so they changed the name to sociology. They said it wasn't a science, and basically they were preventing recruitment in social sciences. So I retrained in the University of Bradford in a postgraduate conversion course in computing, and it was a really interesting one. I worked as a systems analyst in a company for several years. We used an ICL mini computer. We had our own language, and I then found a job at what was then Leeds Poly in the School of Maths and Computing. It was in the Grange, which is in the bottom right there, a place that still exists, of course. In those days, the doors didn't open automatically. You had to give them a real shove. They're quite heavy doors, and the top part had some very narrow corridors, and we had some very tall members of staff and students. So we had students who would literally crack their heads, get concussion walking around the top floor. So if you go up there, if you can wander up, you'll probably see they have sort of great big cushions nailed to beams across the top floor. And in those days we had a sandwich course in computing and OR, operational research. So the students would study with us for 2 years, and they'd go off and have a placement, and then they'd come back for the fourth year. And they were fascinating to see the difference between when they went off in the end of their second year, when they came back in their fourth year. I was lucky enough to get involved in the core courses, and in particularly the final year core course, we taught the difference between what we call soft and hard systems. And it's one of those classic things in English where soft systems are, of course, harder to understand, more complex than soft systems. And we actually had a book which perfectly coincidentally was published more or less at the time we needed it in the mid-80s. The one on the right there, Information Systems Definition, the Multi-View Approach, by Trevor Wood Harper and Lynn Antill and Dave Avison. And they took up the work of this guy called Peter Checkland. Peter Checkland was originally an engineer at ICI for many years, and he then went to the University of Lancaster, where he set up an MA, he called it, you wouldn't call it an MSc, in systems, not information systems. And he, in fact, his book, Systems Thinking, Systems Practice, the first half is sort of Peter Checkland running through the history from philosophy and systems thinking from Plato all the way through up to people like Churchman, Ackoff and Bertalanffy, who you see on the left there. And they had this whole idea about hierarchies of systems and so on. And soft systems were systems where actually defining what the problem was part of the problem itself. So, you know, traffic in big cities was a classic soft system. Is it a case of too many cars, not enough public transport, bad roads, more roads, etc.? And one of the inspirations for Checkland was this man called C. West Churchman, who was an American. And he has this lovely quote about the systems approach begins when you first see the world through the eyes of another, which is a terrific quote. The trouble is, in order to thinking about seeing the world through the eyes of another, you've got to work out who you are. And I always have this problem. And in fact, our daughter Hester, I remember coming back, I think when she was applying for university, she said, there's this form I have to fill in, ethnic monitoring. What do you put for this? And you were faced with a form like the one you see here, which is a complete fudge because it's skin colours, it's ethnicity, it's geographical location. And look at the one there, E, Chinese or other ethnic group. And I always used to put other. And so our daughter Hester said to me, well, what do you put down if you have to put anything? And I said, well, the thing I've decided I put down is that I'm a Yorkshire cosmopolitan. Okay. And that stuck. I still do it if I have to. Cosmopolitan, as you know, of course, is a very nice drink made from vodka, orange liqueur and cranberry juice. Very nice. The Yorkshire version, I suspect, should have a chunk of Wensleydale cheese, maybe a Yorkshire pudding. And then you can begin seeing the world through the eyes of another. And seeing the world through the eyes of another, I had lots of opportunities for this because I managed to find places to teach and research and collaborate with people in lots of exotic and unfamiliar places. I have for many years sort of visiting posts with the University of Amsterdam with people there in a very interesting information management department that was part of a school of social sciences. So we were with people like accountants and business people and so on. Of course, all the students spoke perfect English. They spoke probably better English than some people in courses that we have here. I taught in Malaysia for a very long time at an international master's, which was fascinating, and fantastic students used to fly in and fly out there. And I had people from this university, from other universities around the world who came there. They actually taught. We actually had our course, and some of them came here in the 90s to do a placement for a period of time. Lizzie, who's just come in, had several, I think 6 of them living in her house at the time. I taught in Shanghai. We had some master's students who invited me there, and I went there for 2 weeks, and then 30 of the students decided they wanted to come over and do their masters with us. So we had a large number of people who came over. And I even went to Lancashire and taught at the University of Lancaster for a while. So these are all strange and exotic places. The place I actually spent a large amount of time over many years in the late 90s was in South Africa, where we had a fly-in, fly-out master's program, and they actually studied our master's courses, and we would fly out. The deal was that we would teach a module from a Thursday to a Sunday, so the students would do 2 days of their own time, the weekend, and their employers would give them 2 days leave, and they would do their work, and they were terrific. And they actually came over for graduation, which of course in those days was in November. And I always have to explain to people that, you know, South Africa in November is their summer, and they were coming over to pretty cold, wet Yorkshire. But they came, and they had a great time. We assumed that we should have a minimum number of students, which I think we had as 40. We didn't specify a maximum, and it grew and grew and grew until we had 80 students, which was fine for lectures, but for sort of group work was quite difficult. So we capped it at 80, and we had to have 2 of us flying out. And the people who ran the course and did the admin there rented the top floor, as you see, of this building, which was the War Museum in Johannesburg, which of course up until the early 90s had been all about the Boers and the Boer War and so on, because by this time, late 90s, there was also ones about the ANC and the War of Liberation and so on. The students very quickly called it Guns and Roses, because you see the tanks in the front. Around the other side, you had sort of, well, I assume they were empty shell casings and sort of flowers arranged around them. Okay? And we had these 80 students, and they were an amazing mix. We had what were called the pale males. The pale males were the sort of men in their 40s, pale skin. They knew they'd had a pretty good deal up to then because of apartheid, but now things were being rebalanced, so they didn't get new qualifications. They weren't going to get any advancement. And we also had the young black professionals, and we threw them into groups to work at random. They couldn't choose. And I actually said to one of my colleagues at one point, as we looked at a table of about 10 of these guys, men and women, I use guys in the completely inclusive sense, I said, you realise 10 years ago, the white guys are probably doing their military service, patrolling the townships for some of these blacks were school kids. But they all got on and mucked in. It was amazing. But we had some language difficulties. And these three terms, robots, techies, and stiffies, which came about. Robots were traffic lights. So I remember being taken from the airport one day and I said, you know, where's the hotel? And the guy said, we turn left at the next robot. Someone else told me that apparently Lancashire people, his grandmother in Lancashire used that term for a traffic light. Techies were trainers, okay? And then I had one student, I went there one day and he said to me, he hadn't had a chance to print out his work, but it was on his stiffy. And I said, I think I know what you mean. If you remember, there used to be two types of computer disks. There were the old ones, which were literally flexible. Okay, so they were floppy disks. It didn't make sense to call a hard, rigid plastic one a floppy disk. In South Africa, it was called a stiffy. And I said, I think I know what you mean. If you come to the UK, please. It's an interesting way of seeing the world through the eyes of others. And around this time, I was sort of reminded that actually I was a sociologist. And if I've got that tune wandering around your head now about remember you're at one ball, then I apologise. But and it was because part of the people who we taught in South Africa, some of them we took on as PhD students. Most of them actually didn't complete. One did a very long time later, but this one guy, Herbert Smith, came along and said he wanted to use this thing called grounded theory in his research. Grounded theory isn't actually a theory, it's a method. And it was developed in the 1960s, initially by these, or most notably by these two guys, Barney Glaser and Anselm Strauss, in a book that's very famous amongst people in methodologies called Discovery of Grounded Theory. And it was based on work they did at the University of California, San Francisco, where Strauss was the professor. And actually, they worked with a third person who's almost always forgotten. It's a woman called Jean Quint. And Jean Quint worked with them. In fact, she collected most of their data, and he became very famous. Basically, in the 60s, this idea of treating people in terminal care or who were dying, that's not what hospitals were there. They got forgotten. If you didn't get cured, you know, you sort of got pushed to the side. In fact, Strauss had been involved in a project when he was at the University of Chicago, called Boys in White. And I always have to explain to my students, boys became doctors in the 50s, girls became nurses. So calling it Boys in White was about how medics were trained. And when he wrote the book on awareness of dying, there's a footnote which says, Boys in White doesn't mention at any point how doctors were meant to deal with dying patients. Nurses were much better. Okay, so Jean Quint was a nurse and so on. And Herbert Smith made me go off and read these books, particularly Discovery of Grounded Theory, and I wrote a sort of what I now think was it was perfectly accurate, a little bit pompous thing on regrounding grounded theory, and it was a critique of Glaser and Strauss. I could see why the method was great. I could see why it worked. And Awareness of Dying is a absolutely wonderful book, but there were problems. First of all, I'm an out-and-out constructionist. I think we construct truth rather than discovering it. And so to talk about theories being discovered seemed a bit strange. Strauss died in the 90s. Glaser died just a couple of years ago. continuing to say grounded theories they emerge from the data, they're discovered. He refused to take on this idea of the researcher as an active participant, and so on. He wrote terrifically and he was very influential, but had a very unproblematic idea about data, which had become very problematic in the 1970s, particularly for people like Karl Popper and Thomas Kuhn and so on. Thomas Kuhn basically said scientists make up facts based on the way they see the world. They're not just out there and there to be grabbed. And I saw these things as, incorrect, but I could see the value of the method. And the method is a very strong one. It doesn't start off with a hypothesis to be proved or disproved. It basically starts off with people going out into the field, collecting data, interviews or whatever, with very general questions. Okay, so they're not trying to prove a hypothesis. In fact, Glaser has this wonderful thing we do not like people going out with what he called immaculate conceptualizations. We don't like them coming out with just things out of nowhere. It has to be grounded in the data. And the interesting point was Glaser and Strauss, the reason they were interested in dying particularly, Strauss, they were at this massive part of the University of California based in San Francisco, which is, if you think, Jimmy's and the LGI together are big, the campus of UCSF is massive. It's a small town and it trains doctors and nurses. People get PhDs in nursing and so on and so forth. And each of them had recently lost a parent. So they were interested in this for personal reasons as much as anything. And so what they were doing was saying, don't start off with an idea of what you want to look at. In fact, they even told their students, don't read the literature, which is a massive problem which students have these days, because they come along and say, I'm not going to read the literature before I start my research. And of course, any research committee will say, you can't do that. How do you know you've got a problem that someone hasn't already solved? But the idea was you've used your early data to develop your model in a preliminary way and then carry on at some later stages. And you work with what I called theories of the middle range. You're not trying to produce highfalutin theories that explain everything. In those days, the highfalutin theorist in the States was a man called Tulker Parsons, and Glaser and Strauss were clearly attacking him. In fact, discovery of grounded theory is a manifesto aimed at academic social scientists. And they said you had to be open to what they called serendipity. Serendipity is one of those bizarre words. Okay? It's the old name for what's now called Sri Lanka. And it's based on this story by Hugh Walpole. Actually, it's based on an earlier, I think, Persian story about three princes who go along and things happen to them, but they're nice things. Okay, so this is what they do. And what Glaser and Strauss were saying was, we're coming up with these theories, and their awareness of dying is an immensely powerful book. I can remember when my mother was dying, the fact that I'd read Awareness of Dying and knew about these ideas of closed awareness and so on. Griselda and I knew much more. We had conversations with the medical staff. They said things to us. We knew that's not going to happen. We know what's going on here. And the idea which Glaser and Strauss found was that grounded theories are often found to be practically useful long before other researchers had come along and said, oh, yes, that's right. We've proved that. We've repeated it. And when you talk to grounded theorists, many of them are in health, education, and so on. They say, well, this seems to work. And that was a really important point. And I then realized that I've been doing grounded theory without realizing it, a bit like thinking informatically, when I was a systems analyst in the 80s and 90s. So in the 80s and 90s, of course, computers were just coming in many ways. We didn't have, first IBM PC comes in 1980, but we're talking about mainframes and big mini machines. And so systems analysts were going into companies and saying, here's where a computer may be of use, or a computer system may be of use. And in fact, our master's program, which was one of the things that we developed when I first came to Leeds Poly, we had a whole thing which was called the systems analyst as the agent of change. So basically, the systems analyst goes into a company and by asking questions, manages to elicit what's going on, which other people either don't realize or take for granted because that's what they've always been doing. Okay, and I actually had one crazy experience once when I went in. We did a systems analyst, systems approach for a company, and it was a company, and what they did was, and we checked this with at least two other sources, we went to someone in accounts and they said, you know, blah, 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 and someone puts in an order, and then we offer them a 10% discount because they're a good customer, and we send them a check for the 10%. And I said, that can't be right. You're paying them 10% of the money. You haven't got them the other 90. That cash, you know, I know about cash flow. That's not right. No, that's what we do. And I checked with 2 other people. When I presented it with my boss to their board, the finance director, I won't use the language, but he basically said to my boss, who is this person? They don't know what they're doing. There's a complete idiot. I'll have nothing more to do with you. And my boss and I left, and I said, it's true. It's absolutely true. And we were somewhere away. We drove back to our office in Leeds. When we got back, didn't have mobile phones in those days, kids. So when we got there, there was a message from the CEO of the company saying, I've just fired my finance officer, and I'd like to apologise, particularly to Tony. He's absolutely right. We're giving money away with 10% before we get the other 90%. I don't know how this got started. It's completely crazy. Okay? But he's found it out. Our finance officer didn't know anything about it. So he's either not doing his job properly or he's lying, but he's gone. I felt very sorry, but the guy was really nasty to me. So the idea of a systems analyst is you get people to talk about what's going on. You don't go in with a set of exact questions, okay? You don't impose the design of a previous system, okay? And you go in with what's called an open mind, but not an empty head. So people can tell you things, and you're open to serendipity. Okay? And this is linked to this idea of soft systems. You're not just coming in as a consultant, you're part of a domain, and any outcome you have is provisional. Again, one of the early systems I did worked on was a massive system for what was called the Charities Commission. They had all the names of small charities. We're not talking about the big cancer charities, but the small charities, and there were thousands of them, 80,000 plus it turned out. Okay, and it was held in leather-bound ledgers and on cards, index cards. Okay, and some of the leather-bound ledgers charities went back to sort of 17th or 18th century. The winning charity we had was the Charity for the Redemption of Christian slaves from Barbary pirates, which had funds. No one had used them, and we had to work out where they should go. And I remember we put that computer system in the 80s, and one of them said, actually quite prescient, said, what happens in the year 2000? And I remember my boss said to him, oh, you'll have had a new system in by then. And you could see this guy going, but this system, the previous system we've had for hundreds of years, and now you're saying in 10 years we have to have a new computer system. Well, you did. So systems design had to have relevance, they had to fit, they had to work within the context, and they had to be modifiable. If you couldn't change it, you couldn't change a computer system, that was really bad news. So these are all similar criteria to for grounded theory. And so I began to do some work on grounded theory. I never intended it to be more than a sort of passing phase. And I came across a chapter on grounded theory in the second edition of the Handbook of Qualitative Research. Handbooks, as you know, are often so big you need about 3 hands to hold them. But the Handbook of Qualitative Research is about 700 or 800 pages. And the person who wrote this chapter was making very similar points to me. And I contacted her. I sent her an email and said, here's something I've written. You might be interested in it. I didn't know she was actually a grounded theorist of many years standing. She'd actually studied with Glaser and Strauss. She'd been in the first cohort of PhD students. And it was sort of a bit of serendipity that I came across it, and a bit of that great word called chutzpah, which is just to say, I'm going to send this to you and see what happens. She could have either not replied or said, thanks very much, but who are you? She did neither of these things. Kathy Sharma, as her name, became a great friend of mine. Unfortunately, the friendship ended in 2020 when she died, but it was the beginnings of a beautiful friendship and a very productive one. So she produced her book at the top left there, that's the second edition, but the first edition came out in 2006, and it's called Constructing Grounded Theory. So she's not saying you discover them, you have to construct them, you've got to put the work in. And she's very much the founding figure of what's called constructivist grounded theory. We put a handbook together, 2 handbooks together, the one on the bottom right there. We went to Sage with a book proposal for 5 or 6 chapters, and usually academic editors come back and say, no, that's too long, you have to shorten it. We had the very welcome thing of the editor saying, oh, Sage, you've got lots of handbooks on research methods. We don't have one on grounded theory, which is by far the most widely used method. Why don't you have a 500 or 600 page handbook? So we expanded it. I was under no illusions. And when the editor said to us, make sure, because you only usually get about 50% of the people you invite will accept. Well, 80% accepted. And in fact, the 3 people who reviewed the proposal said, we want to add a chapter as well. And that was because Kathy Sharmas was involved, not because of Tony Bryant. They didn't know who Tony Bryant was in those days. But 10 years later, we produced another handbook, and Kathy and I produced loads of different articles and so on. And she pioneered the whole idea of constructivist grounded theory. And she took it into the realm of what she called social justice research. So grounded theory was about giving voice to people in the research practice. So you didn't have research subjects, you had research participants. You worked together with them, you gave voice to them. And she came up with this idea about what she called critical inquiry, addressing ideas of power, inequality, and injustice. And you see the name there, Donna Mertens, but Norm Denzin, again, who died just a year or 2 ago, he was the sort of one of the founding figures of qualitative research methods. He was the editor of the handbook. Sort of Norman Denzin in the UK, David Silverman, who is, I think, part of the audience this afternoon, is the sort of guru across in England and Australia when he's not watching cricket, even when it's very cold. And so Kathy became a very important figure in that. And so in thinking informatically, I think we're looking at these number of things. We're looking at this idea about systemic thinking begins when you see through the eyes of another and you give voice to that other. Kathy Sharmas with her idea about constructivist grounded theory, which has its roots in symbolic interaction from the Chicago School of Sociology, and pragmatism. I can give a whole lecture on pragmatism, but that's a really important aspect. And it's summed up by this man called Flivberg, who is, I think, from working in the University of Oxford, but one of the contributors to the second handbook talks about this, and it's talking about this idea of what's called phronesis, which is this idea of wisdom or intelligence that is relevant to practical action. And people who practiced it, when you tell them you've got an idea, they say, so what? What's the impact? And they say, what's happening? Where's it going? Who gains and who loses? By which mechanisms of power? Is it desirable? What is it telling us should be done? So these are all practical issues. And again, it links to the systems analysis. There was no point in my systems analyst coming up with a systems design if it couldn't actually be put into practice. Okay, so it had to be part of that. So an example project, freelance programmers for F International. And this came about, and again, you can't see the audience, but it was Andy, by the way, in South Africa, put me in touch with the founder of F International. And the founder of F International was founded a software house in this country in the 1960s. In the 1960s, people didn't actually buy software. You bought hardware, mostly from IBM, and the software came with it. The idea of somebody, setting up to sell you software was ridiculous, as far as people were concerned. But there were these 3, all women, founded software companies. The woman in the top right there was called Elsie Schutt. She worked for Raytheon in Massachusetts. And when she became pregnant, they had to fire her because you couldn't work if you were a woman who was pregnant and had kids. And so she set up her own small company with, I think, 2 other women, but she never wanted to grow it very much. The woman on the bottom left there was a woman called Dinah St. Johnston, or Dinah Vaughan. And she and her husband set up a software company in this country, particularly specializing in software for railways and signaling. And she was reputed to be such a good programmer that she wrote her program notes in fountain pen. Okay, now anyone who's used coding sheets will know you do it in pencil and you're rubbing it out and changing it. She was reputed to. And the top person there was someone called Steve Shirley, who is again with us this afternoon. Steve Shirley was born in 1933, came over to this country in the Kinder transport. She became a British citizen and changed her name to Stephanie Brooke, married Derek Shirley, who unfortunately died a few years ago. She worked in several technical positions. At one point, she worked for the research office of the post office. But she says in her autobiography, when she went out with boyfriends, she just said, I work at the post office, and let them assume, which of course they did, that she just sold stamps and postal orders. And in 1962, she decided to set up her own company called Freelance Programmers Limited. And she always says it's all lowercase because they had no capital. Where did Steve come from? Well, she began writing letters for responses to invitation to tender and for work and so on. And she didn't get any responses, or not many responses. And so I think it was her husband suggested that she shorten her name to Steve. People would assume it was a man, and that would at least get her the entry into their office and get them to talk. And she, as she says in her book, she's been Steve ever since. And she set this company up called FPL, Freelance Programmers Limited, which became F International. It employed several thousand employees at its height. They had to change in the 1970s because when Equal Pay Acts and Sex Discrimination Acts came in, they could no longer say we only employ women. So they had to take jobs, the applicant from men and women, and say the person who put Steve and myself in touch a couple of years ago was Andy, by the way, who had worked for them at the time. And as you'll see, their founding statement was, we are providing jobs for women with children, then later on for women with dependents, then later on for women who would not get employment in other companies. And in 2021, through Andy, by the way, as I mentioned, Steve contacted me, and she said in her email to me and in conversations we'd had, why did my company, which became this huge company, several thousand employees with lots of women in top positions, they did have some men as well, it just disappeared. The ethos disappeared. Why? What happened? And so she put me in touch with about 15 or 20 of the people who had worked with her for a very long time. The person here you see, the IT girl or the IT girl, Anne Moffat, is now a very sprightly woman in her 80s living in Queensland. But what's there is a photograph of her with a little daughter, who she told me is now, I think, 60. And she is writing the assembly code for the black box for Concorde. The black box, of course, as you probably know, is not black, it's orange. That's what those things are. And I had a series of conversations with these remarkable women, a couple of men as well. They were the most well-prepared interviewees I have ever had. They found diaries from the 1960s and 70s. They had questions for me. They had all sorts of things. It was an absolute joy to do it, all online, of course, because we're in the middle of lockdown. And so in August 2022, they had their 60th anniversary. And Griselda and I went down. I did a presentation to this group. Obviously, there are a few men there, but they're mostly women who had worked for F International, some of them even from the days of Freelance Programmers Limited. My conclusion was not why had F International disappeared, but how had it managed to last as long as it did. And that was really because of how remarkable Steve Shirley was and some of the people who were working with her. So in other words, it was always going to be subject to what I call the exigencies of male-dominated commercial existence. And the reason it came out in the first place in the 50s, 60s, 70s was because we had what we'd call an interregnum. So the growth of ICT, massive upheavals in the workforce, big organizations like NASA were so desperate to have people who could program and deal computers. They not only allowed women and women with children, women who were pregnant, they even had coloured women and black women. So you remember the film Hidden Figures, okay, this term coloured computers, okay, they wanted anyone who had those skills. Okay? The trouble was, by the 1980s, things were already beginning to settle back again. And you can see figures like this, where the number of women in computer science peaks at 30-odd% in the 80s and dips all the way down. And again, I can remember when I came to Leeds Poly, as it then was, and did computing and OR, we had about 50% women on the course. Within a few years, that had gone down below 10%. And so the computer had this impact on organizations. It shocked the organization. People didn't know how to use them. You get these bizarre things like the head of IBM in the 40s saying, they'll only need 5 or 6 computers, because computers are used by mathematicians to prove complex mathematical equations. Nobody will ever want a computer at home, etc., etc. And this idea was that women were computers, men were engineers. Okay, and there were things in the 50s and 60s where you had at the bottom there you had the typing pool. Most of you are probably too young, but in those the days where men, CEOs, etc., they would dictate letters to their secretary, or as a woman, they would either do it onto tape or they would do it to the woman writing shorthand, and they would go down into the depths of the building where the typing pool would type everything out on a typewriter. you know, 3 copies, carbon paper, etc. And you had a computing pool at certain points in certain companies. And this is now a topic that's been very well documented in lots of terrific books. 2 in particular here, Programmed Inequality by Ma Hicks and Recoding Gender by Janet Abate. They're both Americans. And I'm delighted that, again, a bit of chutzpah on my part, I asked them if they would contribute to a special issue of First Monday, which will probably be coming out first quarter of 2025. So they're both contributing chapters on women and STEM. I'm going to do one on the issues around F International and so on. Jackie Campbell's doing one. We've got about 7 or 8 really key people writing about some of these aspects. And when I began trying to understand this process, I had a very good example very close to home. A classic book written 50 years ago now, no, yeah, 45 years ago now, called Old Mistresses by Griselda Pollock and Rosika Parker. You see them up there. I took that photo when Griselda and Rosie were actually working together on the book. I think it's on the back cover of the first edition. And they wrote this book called Old Mistresses, which of course has connotations other than being the feminine version of Old Masters, okay? But there have been problems with translation. But what was happening in the 70s, where people were discovering, hey, there've been women artists, women can paint, there've been women artists. And what Parker and Pollock argued was there'd always been women artists, okay? But they'd actually only really been scrubbed off the face of cultural map in the early part of the 20th century. In fact, I think one of the exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art had not had any women artists in at all in the early part of the 20th century, the century of women. And so they said this was, women were being erased from cultural memory. They weren't creative participants in culture. And so thinking informatically was actually saying, this is this amazing part of history of computing, okay? Steve Shirley embodies it in an amazing way, but there are other aspects as well, which people like Ma Hicks and Janet Abate have done. And we're battling to catch up the whole time. And we know this because every few months around the world, there is an initiative to get women into STEM or women into ICT or whatever, women into engineering. And the fact there are always so many of them tells you they're not working. There are other issues, there are other things which are going on. And so you've got this situation that women at the top are the women in NASA, and then the women at the bottom are the women in F International. And we've really got to ask, you know, are these pioneers or are they going to be further hidden figures? They're going to disappear from history. Okay. So we have this interregnum, and there are this idea of an interregnum, which comes from, well, originally it comes from when a king died and a new king came in, okay? But it comes in the sociological, political sense from the Italian sociologist Antonio Gramsci, who said the old is dying and the new cannot be born. And this is not a good thing because it says, as he says, you get a variety of morbid symptoms. And there are 3 dates. Siller and Eatman had 2. I'm sorry, I have to use 3, which I think are important. 1989, World Wide Web. 2007, the smartphone. And then very recently, 2022, ChatGPT-3. And this is preparing the ground for a remade world. So Tony Bryant comes along in '89 and he gives the world the World Wide Web. The internet had been around since the 60s. And the World Wide Web was meant to be this fantastic place to put everyone in touch with one another. Again, as I said, the Cold War had come to an end. Barriers were breaking down. It seemed ideal. But numbers don't always mean the same thing. And I always loved when we first went to Australia, it was about the time that Crocodile Dundee came out. And it's a great scene which Crocodile Dundee has. You remember he is taken from the Australian outback to New York, okay? And when he's taken to New York, he's taken up to the hotel in Manhattan and he looks out over this amazing cityscape and says, how many people live here? And the guy says 7 million. He says 7 million people all living so close to each other. It must be the friendliest place on earth. New York, of course, in the 70s was far from friendly. But as far as he was concerned, in the Australian outback, he lived away from people because he didn't want to be near them. So all these guys wanted to live, they'd chosen to live with each other. And of course, Tim Berners-Lee realized how wrong this was. And so in 2019, just before the pandemic hits, he's marking, I won't say celebrating, marking the 30th anniversary of the World Wide Web, And instead of saying, isn't it wonderful, he's saying we're in danger of ending up in a digital dystopia. Here is this technology, and it's just in exactly the wrong directions. And then in 2007, when you get the smartphone, I did a little bit of injustice to the quote there, but it put the check capital J for Steve Jobs. But Facebook is around in 2004, but it really takes off in 2007 with the smartphone. 2004, the big thing is MySpace. Remember MySpace? Okay, that's probably still a few million people use it, but nothing compared to Facebook and so on. And we end up with a technological dystopia. We end up with all the things we now associate with social media: misogyny, anti-Semitism, racism, hate speech, etc., etc. Now, just to add to that, we have generative AI. This was just a simple Google search I did when preparing this. Sexist AI is even more sexist than we thought. AI can be sexist and racist. When good algorithms go sexist, AI image generators often give racist and sexist results. Can they be fixed? I mean, these are the sorts of things people are having issues about. And some of the big names in technology say, we've got this all wrong. And one of the things behind these things, like ChatGPT and what are called large language models or chatbots, this woman, Emily Bender, has come up with a great term called it's stochastic parrot. Parrots can be trained to repeat what people say, but they don't actually understand what people say, or we assume they don't. Okay, so a stochastic process is one where you're not quite sure what the outcome is. So Bender and co wrote this paper that's now very widely referenced on the dangers of stochastic parrots. The second author there, Timnit Gebru, was the woman who was the whistleblower at Google, lost her job when she pointed out things that Google were not doing, and so on. And so one of the things I think is really important in thinking informatically is to be aware of this distinction between hard and soft skills. The trouble is, if you talk about soft, people think that means easy, so not very important, so secondary. So I've begun using the term of algorithmics versus heuristics. The trouble is, again, the computer scientists have got in and they start saying, oh yes, algorithms are correct, heuristics are prone to errors, more errors than algorithms. And I think a lot of it is blamed on this guy. Now, it's very difficult to be highly critical of a Nobel laureate, Daniel Kahneman, and I've read a lot of his stuff and it's very good. But he's partly responsible for this, for the way people have taken it up with this idea of instinctive thinking and slower thinking, which, as you'll see, the instinctive one is almost the heuristic one. It happens as you're doing things. The slower one is the more considered one. And he has lots of good examples in his book, but they're very artificial ones. So the trouble is that people have taken up Kahneman's idea and they say, oh yeah, heuristics, that's a quick way, but if you really want to be certain, you've got to use algorithms. You've got to prove it in some particular way. So I always think, try using an algorithmic approach to childcare. It just doesn't work. So I don't think it does. And also, algorithms are unfortunately error prone. And you've got diagrams like this. I added the stochastic parrot at the top there. But you find that algorithms are based on pre-existing databases, which incorporate bias and things that are incorrect. You get emergent bias that comes out. The very famous example of Microsoft, who put up a chatbot called Tor, T-O-R, they had to take it down after a day because the algorithm said, your algorithm is to produce as much traffic as you can, and it learned within a day that if it was racist and misogynist and had lots of hate speech, it would get lots of responses. And it was just so embarrassing, they took it down. They put up a second version, and even that didn't work. So all these issues are important, and with all the big developments, particularly with things like AI, thinking informatically, I think, has taken on a new urgency. So you need to see through the eyes of another. And again, grounded theory makes you do that, research methods make you do that. Technical people working programming machines not interacting, not such a good thing to do. Try and encompass issues of social justice and critical inquiry. Asking the value rational questions, which I mentioned before. Where are we going? Again, things we try and do I try and do with colleagues in our master's programs is to get people to think critically about the things that are going on around them. And we just finished teaching our master's modules, and the students, I think, really enjoyed it. They really enjoyed being challenged and made to take up some of these ideas. Who gains and who loses? Again, a lot of stuff about AI is all about, oh, what's going to happen? Is it going to affect people's jobs? It's going to make people more equal, have more leisure time, not have access to things at all. Never read a book again because, you know, the chatbot will do it for you or write your essay for you. What are the mechanisms of power? Who controls these things? Again, before big companies, okay, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Apple are so big, so massive, attempts to control them are almost bound to either fail or only partially succeed. The EU have just produced an AI Act. It came out in March. 3 weeks after it came out, people were already saying Facebook and Apple are completely ignoring us. And they said if we push them, they'll withdraw from Europe. I don't know quite how they do that, but you know, that's a threat. Is it desirable? Yes, we can do it, but is it desirable? And what, if anything, should be done? So these are, I think, are important issues. The 30-second version of this lecture, if you like, is the allegory of the long spoons, because we have this technology, okay? It's how we use it. Now, the allegory of the long spoons comes from, it's Talmudic, it's from a rabbi in an ancient town in what's now Lithuania. And he talks about the allegory of the long spoons, about the very devout person who wants to know what heaven and hell are like. And eventually God says, okay, I'll show you, I'll show you. And God takes this very devout person up, down to hell, okay? And there are all these people, and they have spoons tied to their arms. They're very long. There's food in the middle of the table, and they try to dip their spoon in, and they can't. Of course, the spoon is over here. They can't feed themselves. So they are desperate for food. They are crying out. Okay? And then he says, I'll now show you heaven. And there you've got the same food, and the people have all got the spoons tied to their arms in exactly the same way, but they're feeding each other. You can't feed yourself, but you can feed the others. So thinking informatically is when you're looking at technology and saying, I just don't know what this is for me. I want to see what it's going to be like for everybody, for other people, to see what they can find out about. And so we've really got these two options. Okay, they're extremes. Okay, we've got, that's not Tim Berners-Lee's, but it's his view of what he wanted the World Wide Web in 89. Okay, and that's what we're facing. Okay, and it's getting worse, and it's this combination, particularly of social media and smartphones you can carry around with you at all times. And I think we have to have changes in our curriculum. I think we have to look at some of these people. The guy in the top left there is a man called Raymond Williams. I did my PhD partly about him. He was a remarkable cultural analyst in the 50s and 60s, into the 70s, worked neglected now. I think he needs to come back. The man on the top right there is a man called William Gibson. He's a Canadian author, remarkable fiction writer. He's the man who coined the term cyberspace. Okay, he actually did. This is not apocryphal, it's absolutely true. In a book he wrote called Neuromancer in the 1980s. He wrote it on a typewriter because he said he didn't know how computers worked. In the book, it's all about computer systems. So how he got this right, I don't know. The bottom right there is Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. A lot of stuff has come from that. And the book on the left is by a man called Kim Stanley Robinson, called The Ministry for the Future. It's about 2 or 3 years old. The news coming out today that climate scientists have finally given up and said 2.5 degrees, 3 degrees, forget it. We're heading for 5 degrees, an absolute disaster. Well, he's got a really, it's an amazing book. It's well worth reading about the way he thinks things might happen, including a very useful way of using blockchain. And I've never found a good useful way of using blockchain. It always seems to be about money laundering, but he has a really good example. So I think we need to think about changes in the curriculum, and we need to change our ways of thinking. Have you worked out where all the yellow quotes come from?
Yeah, it's Bob Dylan.
Well done, absolutely. Yeah, so we've got to see all these different questions, okay, and all those quotes come from the Bard of Duluth, Minnesota, Bob Dylan, with his, I love that cartoon of SpongeBob Dylan. I'll do that more often. We've got to find ways of thinking informatically and instilling this in our students. Thank you very much. If there are questions, I'd be delighted to take them. Questions from people. There are mics around, they will pick you up. Anybody online? I can see there are lots of people who are there, ex-colleagues and so on. If you put anything in chat, I'm sure we can have a look at that.
Tony, you raised questions, issues, but you haven't give any solutions.
Sorry?
You raised questions, but you haven't given any solution.
Look, you're absolutely right, and I'm very glad you said that. No, I haven't come up with any solutions. One of the solutions is a, if you like, an interim solution, which is to address the issues because they're just not being addressed in many areas. You know, and we're in a school which is looking at lots of technical issues. You know, built environment, which I know does look at other issues because they're looking at things about sustainability and so on and so forth. But we're teaching our students issues around use of AI, data mining, data analytics, and so on. But are we getting them to think about these more critical aspects? I don't think there's any one solution, but I think it would be good if we felt people leaving Leeds Beckett courses in our particular school raised these questions, and it is working. As I was saying before, one of the essay topics we use in critical perspectives is about women and ICT. And when I introduced it, someone said to me, "Oh, only the women students will do that." Well, it's actually not true. About 20–25% of our 80-odd students have chosen that topic. More than half of them are men. Okay, and a lot of them have actually said, when I've done the reading, they said, "I never knew about this. I never realised it." So it's only a very partial one. The point about soft systems is there is never one simple solution, but you're absolutely right. We do have to think about where we're going with this.
And your journey of teaching, as you started from before the technology revolution it came up and even now, which time you interested more, or which time the student was more integrating to the science or to their classes?
Okay.
All time or now?
I think it happens on and off with different students. I've had students who've come to me with very technical PhD topics, which they then moved. The famous example I had, which was a husband and wife, a couple, and the wife came to me with a view that she wanted to look at design issues. She didn't know exactly quite what, but she wanted to look at design issues. And I sent her off to work with a couple of colleagues in a group on design, and she did a fantastic PhD on design. Her husband was an engineer, and he came and he said, "I want to do my PhD on decision support systems." And he came from a very technical background. They were both from Portugal. And he said, and I said to him, "What's a decision?" And 18 months later, he came back with a whole literature he had read on decision making, including looking at soft systems. And I said, and he did a terrific PhD. In fact, Trevor Wood Harper was his external one, the authors. And I said to him at the time, I said, "What did you really think when I asked you that question?" Because my view was he was either going to say, "Well, that's obvious, you know," and he had a very technical view, and I would probably have to send him to someone else to be supervised. But he took the challenge and came up. He actually went off and interviewed several decision makers, including our then Vice Chancellor, the head of Leeds Bradford Airport. He and his wife were from Portugal. He went down to interview Jose Mourinho, who at that time was in his first incarnation as Chelsea manager. And the amazing thing was, he said, all of them said, "We know we make decisions, we know we make mistakes, our aim is to learn from those mistakes." They were not, even Mourinho was saying this, he made mistakes, okay? Yeah, and this was an amazing, so I've had people at different times who have come up with these views of sometimes thinking they're in a very technical area and then realizing there are other issues involved. But thanks, it's a great question. Yeah, Jackie.
Hi, I will ask a question, Tony. Thank you for that. Really enjoyed it. And thanks for the Women in Tech story that we all really enjoy. I'm going to throw a question at you that I know that you ask very often. What about this? You can take this to be what you want. Has surprised you, Tony? What surprised you?
Over the years, I think what surprised me is the ways that the technology has developed. I'm always amazed at the way in which people hype technology and then realize it's not quite doing what they anticipated. And I think we're in the middle of a massive hype at the moment about things like generative AI and so on. Other things have surprised me is, for instance, when the thing with ChatGPT came in and we began to realize, you know, students were producing essays. And not just that, but I'm an editor of several journal submissions come in where the people say to me, you think this is generated by AI? You know, we've run this through various things like I thought authenticate and so on. But the way that we've actually said this to students, and someone said, you mustn't tell the students about this. And I said, they know about it long before we do. This is not an issue. We just have to make them aware we know about it. And particularly with our master students, a lot of them have come back and have adapted to it very well. They've said, no, we are going to use this and we're going to use it to help us with our grammar, but we will keep earlier versions and so on. So there is a way, and the generation that comes up behind them, I have more fears about. Okay, but, so I think the things that struck me is just the amazing. When I think back to the ways in which the technology has advanced, one of the things I do with my students is when I worked in computer programming in the 70s, people used to have what were called exchangeable disk packs. They were like this. They were like they looked like records, but they okay. And you put these on top of a machine that looked a bit like a large fridge or a sewing machine. Okay? And I have one. I don't know why I have it. I've taken it from a place I worked, and it weighs about 5-6 kilos, and I said to students, this has 350k of data, you know, it's a third of a megabyte. And then I hold up a 1 terabyte things, and I would say, you know, the worst sound in the world was a head crash as the heads went in to read. You know, one of the systems companies we worked for was Barrett the Builders. And I remember going up to Aberdeen, I think, to one of the sites, and it was a building site with just this sort of temporary hut in the middle of it, with the computer running payroll, okay, and various other things. And the guy said to me, it was a Tuesday, he said, you have to have this fixed by Thursday, because on Friday, if we don't have the pay packets in the envelopes of the builders, they won't stand outside this, they'll just lift up the building and come in and ask for their money, okay. So you have to get this right. So it's those changes in the technology which have really surprised me. And the cover of my book, Thinking Informatically, is a cartoon where it's meant to be Alexander Graham Bell, who actually didn't invent the telephone, but we all think did. And someone is saying and it's got, if you noticed, it had a gramophone and or whatever, and it's saying, don't worry, Mr. Alexander Graham Bell, nobody will ever want a phone that plays music and keeps, you know, etc., etc., etc. So all those things have surprised me. I think what's disappointed me is the way that social media and the smartphone has produced this really toxic combination, which is something which certainly I don't think people understood. They do now, but the genie's out of the bottle. It's too late, I think.
I think you've got some questions in the chat.
We do. Thank you very much.
Questions.
Government intervention.
Okay, Dan Remini. Thanks, Dan. I don't think it can, Dan, and I think the fact the EU is struggling, and that's much bigger than any single government. Joe Biden has produced what he called, I think in last year, guidance to AI. But the trouble is, once the legislation comes out, the technology's already leapt on. And it's keeping one step ahead. In fact, from my last lecture, which I did for the master's students, which was on AI governance, when ChatGPT and other chatbots came out in November 22, I actually said to somebody as a joke, I said, the way in which you will fool people that you haven't used a chatbot is you'll get a chatbot to produce the work, and then you will introduce grammatical and spelling mistakes. Okay? The week before last, I found a site that says, we will take your chatbot and we will turn it into human type things by introducing spelling mistakes and grammatical mistakes. So they're already there. Okay. So I don't think government legislation will work. I think partly people in government, they've done things like PPE at Oxford and so on. They don't understand the technology, and that's a real problem. And I think that's a real issue which they have.
It sounds like you think that art might help, though, Tony.
Absolutely.
In terms of your references there, if you look at
Absolutely.
Robinson and Gibson and artists provoking us, maybe is a better way of doing it.
And I say people, I was invited to contribute to a book on something called the digital commons. Okay. Now the idea of the commons, I don't know if you know, was this idea that there's this man called Gilbert Hardin came out with this thing called the tragedy of the commons, which said in the days when everyone had their own strip of land and you had this common piece of land, the tragedy was everybody put their sheep to feed on that bit of land. It got completely ruined. Okay. The thing people always forget about Hardin was he was a very nasty right-wing racist guy, but so the tragedy of the commons is a very slightly peculiar thing. But the idea of the digital commons is saying we have this amazing thing called the web and the internet more broadly. We have open source. Here are these wonderful things we can do. And in fact, the other contributors have got some really great examples from across different countries in Europe and the States and what else. There's a couple of guys in Finland who approached me. But this wasn't an area I was interested in, but I was interested in the way in which the commons, the digital commons was being, because also what happened with common land was, and it's the famous thing that Karl Marx writes about in Das Kapital, is what's called the highland enclosures, where they basically threw people off the land so they could have big property, and the people who were thrown off the land had no option because they couldn't exist on their lambs and their crops anymore. They had to sign on in factories. Okay, so the idea of the digital commons is it gets privatized, and again people now talk about something called the splinter net, because countries and governments and so on are compartmentalizing the internet, saying, no, you have to pay to use this bit, or this is only for rich people and so on. So I wrote about the way in which literature is actually a really important way of thinking through the things that other people aren't thinking about. And I actually used Kim Stanley Robinson's book. I used Kurt Vonnegut's book, Play a Piano, which is about the 1950s, when he comes in and he basically says, in the future, you know, there will be the engineers, there will be the owners, and there'll be all the rest, and they'll just be left to fend for themselves. Okay, it's an amazing Play a Piano, of course, are those pianos that appear. You can sit there and appear to play, and then actually it's going on a roll. And the other one is William Gibson's Neuromancer. So it's actually saying, yes, we need, you know, and in fact, when I used to teach in Amsterdam, it was an executive master's program. So we had all sorts of people from Philips and University of Amsterdam and Amsterdam City. One year we had an entire group of 15 Dutch policemen who were the most amazing group. One was doing his thesis on Popper and technology. I mean, they read everything. I mean, these were not, you know, whatever. And I set them actually, William Gibson and Kurt Vonnegut, to read as text, to have a discussion. And it was fantastic. I mean, it really was. But you're absolutely right. You need to sort of think this different way of thinking, throw in these texts. Yes, Fraser.
Given that you seem to be saying that AI will be able to write essays that you can't tell whether they're faked or not, do you think we're going to go back to examination in person?
I've actually had the answer to your question. The quick answer is yes. Okay, in my master's module, always referred to as MIDGE, but it's Managing Information in the Digital and Global Environment, but that's the only time I ever say it. It's called MIDGE. Some of you have done it. It's always had an exam. It's always had a written exam. We used to have about 25 students on the module. A couple of years ago, it shot up to about 80. And I actually, one year, I marked 80 exam papers. This last year, so January, end of semester 1, I used the online exam. And it worked brilliantly. It really did. So A, it was much easier to mark, but B, yeah, we've gone back to exams, and we now have vivas. We say to all the students, we may ask you in for a viva. Sometimes the vivas show that the student actually has absolutely no idea of what the work was that they handed in. The thing we use in this university is a thing called Turnitin, which comes up with a similarity grade. And about April last year, it suddenly came up with this thing called AI percentage. And the first 2 pieces of work I had in, which were reassessments, said 100%. And I got the 2 students in, and they were shocked. And they actually showed me the earlier version of their work and how they'd used, I think, Grammarly to check the grammar. And so Turnitin AI is worse than useless.
Of course.
There are other things which are better, but we are essentially back to that. But one of the troubles, I think, with things like AI and chatbots is you can also get the thing to read, summarize a book for you. And think you then know the book, but then you actually haven't read the detail. I'm actually doing some work on grounded theory at the moment for something, and I've gone back to read one of the early Glaser and Strauss papers, and there were details there completely passed me by the first time, and I would never have got them unless I'd actually gone back to the text. So yeah, it is a real problem. I'm glad I'm at this end of my academic career, not not beginning, because I think there are some real headaches in store in that sense. Yes.
I have a question about grounded theory. Are there any other theories which have come close to that in terms of value for looking at information in the way that you have, such as, I don't know, if we're thinking about computing, user-centered design, could that become possible? Anything else that?
Yeah, well, for instance, one of the things there are several major grounded theories. Okay, there's Glaser and Strauss's Awareness, which is an amazing book. They then produced a second theory on the same data called Time for Dying, which then led to something they called status passage. Okay, and Kathy Sharma has produced an amazing piece of work called Supernormalizing, which was about her PhD, where she looked at people, particularly men in their middle age in the States in the 60s, who had a heart attack, and they recovered from the heart attack. And they didn't just go back to normal, they took up sort of squash or racket sports or, climbing or whatever to show we're not just as good as we were, we're even better. Okay? And you can think of sports, there are several footballers I can think of who come back from injury and they immediately get another injury. Okay? They're super normalizing. When Barney Glaser had his 80th birthday and I rang him up to congratulate him, I said, "How are you, Barney?" He said, "I'm fine, I'm super normalizing." But there are very few theories that have that impact. I've found things, for instance, when I had a group of PhD students and they did presentations and I did a quick grounded theory on that, I came up with what I call research pitching, which was, you pitch your research, it was like an elevator pitch, and there were certain aspects they would talk about in there. I'm actually now writing with somebody using the awareness and the supernormalizing models to theorize the pandemic. I think there are people who are using it in information systems. I can't think of any off the top of my head.
I come at your work from the other side, from the sort of the arts and humanities, where in essence the whole concept of humanities education is basically being gutted by AI, right? Because the processes which involve you in personally engaging with a struggle to read, to understand ideas, it's, so one of my things that I'm trying to deal with, which is what do I deal with coming from a generation where we accepted the difficulty that was involved in the process of studying, whereas now the generation has been, as they've come up in the last few years, have become increasingly more anxious about success. And so AI has feeds into this anxiety that you must get a 2-1, you must get something, and the process involved in it. And I think it seems to me so utterly catastrophic for education that even if you set up a system like, turn it in to try and track, give you a percentage, but in the sense that it will soon be outwitted, as you say, by you can write a program to do all of these things, etc. So it seems to me as such a level of political social crisis, because anybody coming out of education who doesn't then encounter somebody who sort of shakes them by the shoulders and say, think about this, they will be in charge of things. And if we think our present, politicians are incapable because they all went to Oxford and Cambridge and got PPs and read classics, or economics or whatever, etc. Think what the next generation. So I can't imagine what younger scholars and people working in education how to deal with the fact that if nobody reads, nobody's prepared to deal with complexity, and there's something that will do it for you. What
I
are
think
the
it's-
levels
I
of
think that is-
training
yeah.
in being able to make decisions, such as around your question of social justice, which these are major human, as you're going back to your thinking sociologically, these are the substance of our human society.
I think it's absolutely right. I mean, I think the technology, I mean, I know some people who look at things like in programming, they say the use of things like AI is fantastic because it does the first 80% of the coding for you. Okay, the other 20% takes 80% of the effort because it's all the error stuff. And so it's a really valuable tool. And I can sympathize with that because I used to program in assembly language. And when I came to a higher level language, suddenly I didn't have to do address registers and worry about stack overflow and that because it was done. Okay, and that's fantastic. But you're absolutely right. The other big issue, of course, is that eventually the big databases, the large language models, could well incorporate all the difficulties, all the nonsense that things like the Microsoft Tor chatbot have, so that the current generation of people, say, let's say take radiologists, okay, they've been trained to interpret X-rays and so on, okay, and occasionally they get stuff in from AI, but they have their own experience as well. But the kids coming up who are going to be radiologists in 20 years' time, they will only ever know what comes out of the AI. So if you remember in Little Britain, the sketch where, you know, computer says yes, computer says no, that's all people will have. They won't have those skills. So you're right, it's a very gloom-ridden future if something isn't done in some way. It has to be probably people in education making sure that students do actually understand. So one of the things has been with the master students is they have actually responded much better than I would have anticipated a year or two ago. I think we'll see when the work comes in in the next week or so. I can't give you any great hope about it.
But just one thing, but if we who remember a world before this don't find a way to share the notion of that world before it with the students who are born into it, just as we try to work out, you know, something had some imagination of picking up these typewriters, you know, we all had grandmothers or mothers-in-law or whatever for whom, you know, a touch-tone things, and even myself, I'm challenged by certain things. But, you know, that seems to me this question of transmission, generation, it seems to be what sharing one world with another world in order that they have some outside of the present.
But as we know, you know, young kids, 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old children assume every screen is a touch screen. They always assume, it's just, there are certain things which we have to worry about, but you're quite right. I mean, you've done work on generations, different generations. That is something we have to contend with, but I'm not sure what the response is, what the answer is.
Sorry, this could go on. Is there any case for value in other skills as well as the written and research-based skills? Like, could it help to move more towards physical work and other ways of engaging with the world?
Well, there are other ways of engaging with the world, but you're losing again. Like, you know, if people are stuck in front of a screen the whole time, then are they engaging? I mean, you know, maybe they're not. I don't think they are necessarily.
So it's the moving away from that as the dominant work way.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm still carrying on teaching. Someone said to me, you know, was this my sort of final thing? Alice and I wrote a paper many years ago about valedictory lectures in the diplomatic service. Interesting enough, Tony Blair banned them because what diplomats were doing was they were getting to the end of a 30, 40-year career of having to say only the correct things. And their valedictory address was their chance to sort of vent all their spleen, often in very nasty ways.
Save that one, Tony.
Whereas initially in the 19th century, these may just have been sort of, you know, amongst friends in the Garrick Club, or, you know, all men together. By the 80s and 90s, these were recorded, these were written down or word processed, and they became very embarrassing, so they were banned. So I'm not quite at the valedictory stage yet, but anyway, it's marking 30 years. And I say I hope there will be others in future years to mark 20 or 25 years, but thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.